In New York society, the first rule was simple. If you had to ask, you were already out. I remember the winter I began to understand that arriving somewhere and belonging there were not the same thing. Our house was correct. Our dinners were correct. My mother made her calls at the proper hours, left the proper cards, said the proper things. And still, we were not inside. Not really. So I began to watch, carefully, quietly, from the window, from the hallway, from the silence between conversations. Because if no one would tell you the rules, you had to learn how to see them. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house in the early morning, before the servants have finished their work, and before the family has properly begun its day. It is not a peaceful quiet, not the deep and uncomplicated quiet of a house asleep, which is a different thing entirely, a quiet that belongs to no one and makes no demands. This is an awake quiet, a waiting quiet. The kind of quiet that holds itself very still because it knows or suspects that something is coming, and has not yet decided how to receive it. I had grown up until the age of 12 in a house in Utica where the quiet was the peaceful kind, simple and complete and without ambition. A house that expected nothing from the world outside and had long since arrived at a comfortable settlement with that arrangement. My father managed a dry goods concern there, a business his own father had built from a smaller one, and it served us as such businesses serve a family of moderate circumstances, adequately, reliably, without drama. We were comfortable. We were known. We had a pew at the First Presbyterian Church, third row from the left, which had been ours for 22 years. The butcher on Genesee Street knew to set aside the good cuts for my mother on Thursdays. The librarian at the Utica Free Library knew my name and my tastes, and had twice ordered books on my recommendation, a fact I found deeply satisfying in a way I would not have been able at 12 to articulate. In summer, the elm trees on our street made a cathedral of the sky, a long green vault from our door to the corner and beyond, dappled and shifting and beautiful in a way that required no effort from anyone, that simply was, that had been so for decades and would be for decades more, unless something changed. Something changed. That is perhaps the central fact of American life in that era, the fact that separates it from the older countries, the settled countries, the countries where a man who is a dry goods merchant is the son of a dry goods merchant, and the father of one too, and no one finds this remarkable or lamentable or in need of correction. In America, in those years, change was not the exception. It was the atmosphere. You breathed it in. You woke up one morning and you were one thing, and you went to sleep that night and you were still that thing, and then a year passed, or 3 years, or 5, and you looked around and the world had shifted so completely that the thing you had been was not quite what you were anymore, and the question of what you were becoming was very large and very open, and not always comfortable to look at directly. My father came back from his first trip to New York in the autumn of 1889 with a light in his eyes I had not seen before. I was 16. I noticed the light before I noticed anything else. Before his coat, which was dusty from the train, or his hat, which he handed to our maid in the doorway with the slightly distracted air of a man whose mind is elsewhere, entirely elsewhere, in a room, in a building, in a city 12 hours' journey from where he was standing. He came to dinner that evening and he told us, my mother and me, my brother was away at school, that a man named Garrett, a partner in a railroad expansion concern, had approached him with a proposition. The details were not shared. The details were not for us, or so was the understanding, though I noticed that my father offered them to my mother afterward, in the small sitting room at the back of the house, with the door not entirely closed. What I understood, from what I could hear and from what I could observe on my father's face and in my mother's careful stillness at the dinner table, was this: something was going to change. The railroad was reaching into new territories. There was money to be made. My father had, through some combination of circumstance and reputation, and the particular qualities that made him the kind of man other men in commercial life trusted with their more sensitive propositions, been offered a way in. He took it. The details were arranged over the winter. By the spring of 1890, the thing was settled. The house in Utica was sold, quickly, to a family from Albany who paid a fair price and moved in within 6 weeks. And we were, with a speed that still makes my head swim slightly to contemplate, residents of New York City. West 53rd Street, a brownstone 4 stories with ironwork on the front steps, and a narrow garden at the back that was mostly paving stones with a single old pear tree in the corner, and an entrance hall that was wide enough to receive guests properly, and a butler named Reeves, who had previously served a family on Murray Hill, and who came with his previous position the way a fine piece of furniture sometimes comes with the room it was made for, fitted, purposeful, carrying in his person and manner an air of correct service that made me feel, for the first 2 months, that I was perpetually a guest in someone else's household. I was 17 when we arrived. I am 19 now. And in those 2 years, I have learned a great deal about the difference between a house and a position, between wealth and membership, between arriving in New York, the physical act of arriving, the unpacking of trunks, the arrangement of furniture in rooms that are new to you but old in themselves, old in their proportions and their plaster moldings, and the way the afternoon light falls through the west-facing windows, and arriving, which is something else entirely, something that takes much longer and cannot be achieved by any single act, and whose conditions are not written down anywhere you can find them. We had the house. We were working on the rest. My mother understood the situation with perfect clarity from almost the first week. She was, and is, a woman of considerable intelligence, applied almost entirely to the management of social life, in the way that a gifted engineer might apply her gifts entirely to bridges, with the same rigor, the same attention to structural integrity, the same recognition that what appears solid can fail if the foundations are not right. She would not have described herself this way. She would have described herself as simply trying to do what was proper, to make the right calls, to be attentive to the social obligations of their new position. But I watched her, and I understood that what she was doing was something more systematic than propriety. She began making calls within 3 weeks of our arrival. Careful calls, researched calls, to addresses she had identified through a process I could only partly trace. Newspaper reading, yes, the society pages of the Tribune and the Herald, which she read with the focused attention she gave to nothing else in those papers. Conversations with the wives of my father's new business associates, who were themselves navigating the same terrain but from different positions. And something else. A quality of social inference that she had developed over years and that allowed her to work backward from effects to causes, from who attended which events to what those events implied about the hierarchy of those who attended them. She wore her good gray silk on these calls. She carried her card case, a small silver one, a gift from my father, engraved with her initials. She went out at the correct hours, between 3 and 5 in the afternoon, which was the accepted time for social calls in that city and that era, and she came home each afternoon with a composed face that told me very little about what had been said or left unsaid in the parlors she had visited. I was not always taken with her. Sometimes I accompanied her, and those visits were an education in themselves. Watching my mother navigate a stranger's drawing room, watching her place herself in the room's social geography with the same attention a chess player gives to the board, watching her decide what to say and what not to say, and how to manage the silences that fell between. I learned more from watching my mother on those calls than I could have learned from any instruction. But she did not take me every time. Sometimes the call was too important to risk my presence, or not important enough to require it. And on those afternoons, I stayed home, and I sat in the front parlor, and I watched the street below through the net curtains, and that watching became, over the course of that first autumn and then winter, its own form of study. The front parlor had a pair of windows overlooking the street, their lower halves screened by net curtains that were translucent enough to see through if you positioned yourself correctly, close enough to see, far enough from the glass that you could not easily be seen from outside. I had discovered this in our second week, more or less by accident, and I had subsequently spent a great many hours in the chair that I moved over a series of small adjustments to the position that offered the best view of both the street itself and the front steps of the houses on the opposite side. I want to be clear that I was not in those hours doing nothing. I was reading, or attempting to read, the social life of the street. I was watching who came and went and when and in what vehicles and with what bearing and manner. I was learning the rhythms of the neighborhood. I was, in the most literal sense of the phrase, taking notes. The mail arrived at 10:30 each morning. Reeves brought it on a silver tray to my father's study when my father was at home, and to my mother in the back sitting room when he was not. From the parlor I could hear the front door and the sound of the tray set down, and then, if I was still and quiet enough, the particular sounds of envelopes being sorted and opened. I became, over time, extremely attentive to these sounds. I learned to identify from the other room the quality of my mother's silence as she went through the morning's post. Most of what arrived was ordinary: bills, business correspondence, which went directly to my father's study, letters from Utica, my aunt, my mother's sister, who wrote every 2 weeks and whose letters my mother read first and set aside quickly with the expression of someone processing information that requires no decision. Occasionally, a note from a tradesman. But sometimes, among the ordinary envelopes, there would be something different, something cream-colored, heavier than the rest, written in a hand that was neither commercial nor merely familiar. And those envelopes I learned to identify by the quality of my mother's silence when she encountered them. An invitation produced a particular silence, not the flat administrative silence of a bill or the brief warm silence of a letter from home, but a silence with texture to it, a silence that was actively doing something, processing, weighing, placing the thing in the larger map of their situation. I became, by the end of that first winter, capable of distinguishing this silence from most of the others. I could tell you, from my chair in the front parlor with a book in my lap, whether the morning's mail contained something socially significant. That first winter, the winter of 1890 into 1891, very few of those significant envelopes arrived. The season passed largely without us, in the way that a river passes a stone sitting on the bank. We were present and visible, and entirely uninvolved in the current. My mother made her calls and returned them, and we attended a small number of gatherings that were decent without being important. And the season concluded in the gray weeks of Lent with us exactly where we had been in November. Known to certain people, unknown to others. Our position unresolved. Our place in the city's social geography still being determined. We did not discuss this at dinner. We did not discuss it in the carriage, or in the back sitting room on winter afternoons when the light failed early and we sat with our needlework and our books. What we discussed in those domestic hours was everything else. the quality of the coal delivery, which my mother felt was consistently below what had been agreed upon with the merchant, the behavior of the new parlor maid, who had a tendency to overwater the plants, the progress of my French lessons, which were going adequately, my father's business, described in the general terms he considered suitable for the female members of his household. We were, as a family, people of considerable conversational range. We simply did not speak about the one subject that occupied, I believe, the greater portion of all our private thinking. I did not mind the silence precisely. I was 19, or approaching it in those months, and I had a room of my own with a window overlooking the back garden where the old pear tree stood leafless through the winter. And I had books enough, and I had the piano, and I had my own mind for company, which had always been, on balance, adequate. But I was not indifferent to the question either. I was curious, had always been curious. It was perhaps the defining feature of my temperament. The thing that had led my mother to describe me, in a letter to my aunt, as a child who asks too many questions about things that aren't her concern, though she said it with a note of something that might have been, beneath the mild exasperation, a species of pride. The Society of New York, in the winter of 1892, was the most interesting puzzle I had encountered, and I was determined, in the quiet, systematic way that the curious determine things, to understand it. I want to explain what I mean by that, because when I say society, I am aware that the word can suggest something shallow. The parties and the dinners and the balls, the dresses and the jewels and the names in the newspaper, the performance of status for its own empty sake. Those things existed and they mattered, but they were the surface. What interested me was the structure underneath, the logic, the way that a system of invisible rules governed the movements of hundreds of people across a city of extraordinary scale and complexity, sorting them into positions that were almost never explicit, and yet almost always clear to everyone involved. I had grown up in a world whose rules I knew intuitively because I had been born into them, because they had been absorbed through years of ordinary life in a place where everything was settled. The rules of Utica, of the First Presbyterian Church, of the Genesee Street merchants, of the modest social world of a comfortable upstate city, were part of me in the way that language is part of you, not learned so much as simply internalized, carried without consciousness, deployed without calculation. I did not think about how to behave in Utica. I simply behaved, and what I did was correct, because I had never been anything other than a person who knew how things were done there. New York was different. The rules were different, and they were not explained, and the not explaining was itself a rule, which I grasped within the first weeks and which reordered my entire understanding of the project we were engaged in. You could not ask. That was the first and most absolute of the invisible laws. You could not ask who was included and who was not, or why, or what it took, or how one went about satisfying the conditions. The asking was the disqualification. The rules existed precisely to separate the people who already knew them from the people who needed to be told. And if you needed to be told, then you were, by definition, not the right kind of person. Not yet, perhaps. Or perhaps not ever. The distinction between those two possibilities was one of the things I spent the winter trying to work out. Our neighbors on 53rd Street were 3 families and a widow. To the right of us, in a slightly wider brownstone with better ironwork, was a family named Whitmore, old money, which I had identified within the first month, 3 generations in New York, the father a lawyer connected to several of the large estate managements uptown, the mother a woman of perhaps 50 whose manner had the quality I would come to associate with true security, which is to say it cost her nothing, which is to say it was not a manner at all, but simply how she was. The Whitmores had two daughters who were grown and had married and moved to houses of their own, and they entertained in the quieter fashion of a family that had nothing left to prove. Small dinners, a few regular musicale evenings in the winter months, the accumulated social life of people who had been at the center of things for long enough that maintaining the center required very little effort. To the left of us was a couple named Havens, younger, perhaps mid-30s, who had been in New York for 5 years and were understood in the language of the neighborhood to be well on their way. He was in shipping. She was the daughter of a family from Boston of moderate but genuine standing. They had been to Mrs Astor's ball once, 2 years prior, and they spoke of this in the way that people speak of something that is not quite certain to happen again, with a combination of pride and carefulness that told you they understood how delicate the ground was under them. Across the street, 2 houses down, a widow named Mrs Delacroix occupied the narrow brownstone with 2 servants and a small white dog named Pip, who sat with her in the front window most mornings, and whom I had come to consider a reliable social indicator. When Mrs Delacroix was preparing for an outing of consequence, Pip disappeared from the window approximately 20 minutes before she did. I had verified this theory on 17 separate occasions, and it had not failed once. And beyond those immediate neighbors, spreading out through the blocks of the upper 40s and 50s and the long reaches of Fifth Avenue, was the larger world of which all of this was only the outermost edge. A world I was mapping, patient as a geographer, in the plain brown notebook I kept in my desk drawer and considered my most private possession. It was not a diary. I had a diary, small and blue, kept in a separate drawer, in which I recorded the day's events in terms I would not be embarrassed to have read. Called on Mrs. Alderton with Mamma. Tea and a conversation about the new exhibit at the Metropolitan. Home by 5. That kind of thing. Sufficient for memory, insufficient for understanding. The record I am describing was different in purpose and in method. It was an attempt to map what I was observing, to turn accumulated observation into something that resembled knowledge, that had structure, that might eventually yield the pattern I was convinced was there, the underlying logic of the system, if only I looked long enough and carefully enough at the evidence. I wrote down dates and times of social activity I could observe from my position at the parlor window. I noted which households received flower deliveries on which mornings, and whether those deliveries were large or small, and from which florists, when I could read the cards on the boxes. I noted carriages. Private ones were different from hired ones, the private ones having a particular quality of vehicle and a particular bearing in the coachman that I had learned to read, and the private ones stopping at a given address said something different from a hired cab. I noted visiting hours, the arrivals and departures of callers, the duration of visits. At our own house, I noted the mail, its arrival, its volume, the quality of my mother's silences. My mother would have found this undertaking comprehensible and alarming in approximately equal measure, I think. Comprehensible because she was, as I have described, engaged in her own version of the same project, her own mapping, her own tracking, her own careful maintenance of social intelligence. Alarming because my method was more explicit than hers, more written down, more systematic in a way that might, to her eye, have looked less like proper feminine observation and more like something else, something that a young woman of her station was perhaps not meant to be. The word she might have reached for, if she had been entirely honest about it, was unfeminine. I was not performing femininity when I sat at the parlor window with my notebook. I was doing something closer to what I imagined a naturalist did in the field, recording data, seeking pattern, attempting to infer the rules of a world I had not been born into from the evidence available to careful eyes. The calling card was, as I came to understand it, the fundamental unit of the entire system. A small thing, a piece of pasteboard, cream or white, approximately 3.5 inches by 2, with a name engraved in the center and sometimes an address in the lower right corner, sometimes a brief title or designation, but usually just the name alone in a typeface whose choice was itself a statement about the person who had selected it. The card appeared simple. It was not. It was a dense and efficient carrier of social information, and the people who used it read it the way a musician reads notation, instantly, fluently, extracting meaning that the uninitiated could not see. My mother's cards read Mrs. James Everett Price, in an engraved Roman serif that was correct without being fashionable, which was itself a choice, or had been. I was not entirely sure she had known enough when we had them made in our first autumn to have chosen it intentionally rather than by lucky default. My own cards, which I had in small supply, read Miss Eleanor Price, in the same typeface. These were acceptable. I had established this through a process of observation and inference that I could not have articulated fully, but that I trusted. The card was used in a system of social obligation and acknowledgement that was, once you understood the vocabulary, fairly precise in its meanings. A first call, a visit to a household with whom one had been newly acquainted or wished to be, was made within a specific number of days of a meeting or introduction, and the timing mattered. Too soon suggested eagerness. Too late suggested indifference or, worse, an overly elevated sense of one's own importance. One called during the accepted hours, between 3 and 5 on the days when one's host was known to receive. If the person was home and received you, you sat and talked for the prescribed duration, which was somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes depending on the intimacy of the relationship. Brief for a first call, longer for established ones, and you left your card, or 2 of them in the case of a couple calling jointly. If the person was not home or not receiving, which could mean genuinely absent or could mean present but choosing not to see you, a distinction that the system delicately declined to clarify, you left your card on the tray in the hall and the call was recorded as having been made. The returned call was equally significant. A call that was not returned within a week was a message. The message varied in its meaning depending on circumstances. In some cases, it meant only that the person was busy or unwell. In others, it meant something considerably more pointed, and learning to read the difference was part of the larger fluency I was attempting to acquire. I thought about the card system for a long time, in the evenings and in my chair by the window, and I came to believe that its complexity was not accidental. The system was exactly as complicated as it needed to be to do its work, which was the work of maintaining social clarity in a city that was, without it, almost impossible to navigate. New York in those years was vast, growing constantly, absorbing new people and new money at a rate that was, by any historical measure, extraordinary. And in such a city, without the card and the call and the careful gradation of obligation and acknowledgement, social life would have been chaos. The system brought order. It established who was connected to whom and on what terms. It made visible, in a form that could be tracked and referenced, the otherwise invisible web of social relationships that determined what you were invited to, who you could call upon, what was expected of you, and what you could reasonably expect. The difficulty, and I thought about this a great deal, was that the system worked only if you already understood it. Its clarity was internal. From outside, it was opaque. You could see people leaving cards and making calls and observe the machinery in motion, but understanding what each action meant required a knowledge of the code that was not written down anywhere you could find it. I was writing it down in my brown notebook, extracting it from observation. It was slow work, It required a great many data points before the patterns became clear enough to trust. But I was patient. I had always been patient, in the way that people who find things interesting rather than urgent tend to be patient. Not the patience of resignation, which is no patience at all, but the patience of genuine engagement, of finding the process as interesting as the destination. I should tell you something about what the social season was in New York in those years, because it was not merely a series of parties. It was a structure, a temporal structure that organized the year's social life into a specific arc with a beginning and an end, with internal peaks and valleys, with events that served as reference points by which everything else was measured. The season ran from approximately the 1st of January through the beginning of Lent, which was typically in February or March depending on the year, and whose arrival concluded the formal season as cleanly as a chapter ending. Within that span, those 8 or 10 weeks, the city's upper social stratum organized itself into a continuous chain of activity. Dinners, music halls, afternoon teas and receptions, informal gatherings of various kinds, and the great formal balls that were the season's punctuation marks, its moments of maximum clarity about who was who. Of those balls, the most significant, the one that established the tone and the relative positions for everything that followed, was the ball given by Mrs. William Backhouse Astor, Jr. in the 3rd week of January. Mrs. Astor was, in the winter of 1892, the undisputed social queen of New York, a position she had occupied for long enough that it had come to seem less like a fact about society and more like a fact about the city itself, something as settled as the geography. Her house stood on Fifth Avenue at 34th Street, and it was large and correct in every detail and served, for the purposes of the season, as a kind of axis point around which the rest of the social world arranged itself. The guest list was managed in those years in close collaboration with Ward McAllister, who was Mrs. Astor's chief advisor in social matters, and who had famously observed some years before that New York contained exactly 400 people of genuine social consequence, 400 being, by coincidence or by design, approximately the capacity of Mrs. Astor's ballroom. The list was not published. It was not posted. It existed only as the sum of the invitations that arrived or did not arrive, and the fact of their arrival or non-arrival was understood by everyone involved as a precise statement about one's social position. We were not on the list. I knew this with complete certainty, not because anyone had told me, no one would, but because I understood the logic. We had been in the city for 2 years. We were new. We were unknown to the people who determined these things. The Astor list was not accessible to new money by virtue of its newness. It was accessible by a process of gradual establishment that took time measured in years, not months, and that required the accumulation of a set of connections and endorsements and social presence that we were only beginning to build. We were not excluded because we had been found wanting. We were excluded because the question of us had not yet been properly raised. This was a distinction I had come to understand clearly by the winter of 1892, and I found it in a strange way clarifying. There was nothing we had done wrong. There was simply a distance still to be covered, and the covering of it required patience and correct behavior and time. My mother made calls. I watched her make them, sometimes from her side and sometimes from my window. I watched what came of them, the returned calls, the occasional invitation, the slow accretion of acquaintance that was the visible product of all that careful effort. One afternoon in the 2nd week of January, Mrs. Whitmore called. I was in the library when Reeves announced her, and my mother received her in the back sitting room, and I was close enough to hear the registers of conversation without hearing the words. The low, controlled sound of 2 women talking in the way that women of that world talked with each other, careful and pleasant, and carrying more information in what was not said than in what was. Mrs. Whitmore stayed for 25 minutes, which was somewhat longer than a purely formal call, but shorter than a genuinely friendly one, and she left 2 of her cards. My mother found me afterward and told me that Mrs. Whitmore had asked after our health and mentioned that the cold weather had been particularly trying this year, and that she had said something about a musical evening she was planning for the following month. Nothing definite, something she hoped we might enjoy. I asked whether we had been invited. My mother said that nothing had been confirmed. I nodded. Nothing confirmed. Something suggested. The suggestion noted, returned to, its implications assessed. This was the texture of social progress in that world. Nothing was ever simply said. Everything was indicated, offered tentatively, left somewhat open, so that it could be retracted without consequence if circumstances required it. The firmness came later, if it came at all. There was a woman I knew by name and sight and reputation, but had not yet met, in those early weeks of January 1892, whose existence occupied a significant portion of my private social thinking. Her name was Mrs. Fellows. I had encountered it first in the newspapers, the society pages, which I read with the same focused attention my mother brought to them, though I tried not to let this be obvious. And then in the conversations I observed and occasionally participated in, where her name came up in the particular way that significant names come up in social conversation. Not frequently, not casually, but with a specific quality of weight and attention that marked it as a name that mattered. She was a widow, as I understood it. Her husband, who had been something substantial in the financial world, had died several years before, leaving her in the position of a woman of means and established position who had no social obligations she hadn't chosen and no one whose career she needed to manage. She received on Tuesdays. She was connected to several of the oldest families in New York through her own family and her husband's, and she had, by my assessment, the kind of social position that could open doors simply by acknowledging that the doors existed. I did not know how to reach Mrs. Fellows. I did not, at that point in January, have the connections that would have made an approach possible, and an approach without proper connection was out of the question in any case. She was a name on a map, a destination I could see from where I was without yet being able to trace a route to it. I wrote her name in my notebook, in the section I had labeled Further, and I noted what I knew about her and what I did not know, and I left it there, filed under the category of things that might eventually become possible. It was in the 3rd week of January that our social situation shifted, in the small, real, unmistakable way that social situations shift when the machinery begins to engage. What happened was this. We received a call from Mrs. Hartwell. Mrs. Hartwell I had located precisely on my social map. She was a woman of perhaps 50, wife of a man connected to several of the Knickerbocker families through his mother's side, and she occupied a position that I would describe as genuinely respectable and moderately influential. Not the summit, not the absolute inner circle, but within clear view of it, with connections that extended upward into the places we were trying to reach. She was known for her Thursday evenings, which were attended by a range of women that included some of the more significant names of the season. She came on a Tuesday afternoon, her own calling day, which meant she was spending a portion of her valuable social time in an outward direction rather than receiving, which was itself a statement about how she was allocating her attention. And she called at 3:30 and spent 40 minutes with my mother in the back sitting room. I was in the library. I heard the particular quality of the conversation, its length, its comfortable, intermittent laughter, its lack of the slight constraint that I associated with calls that were purely formal. When Mrs. Hartwell left, she left 2 of her cards. One turned down at the corner in the manner that indicated she had come in person. And she said something at the door. I heard it from the upper landing, where I had positioned myself with what I hoped was appropriate casualness, that made my mother stand very still for a moment after the door closed. I came downstairs. My mother was in the entrance hall with both cards in her hand. "Mrs. Hartwell has invited us to her Thursday evening," she said. "Next week." I looked at her. She looked at me. "That is very kind," I said. "Yes," she said. "It is." I understood the weight of it. A Thursday evening at Mrs. Hartwell's was not the summit. It was not the Astor ball. It was not a dinner at Mrs. Fellows's. It was not the inner circle by any measure. But it was a step in that direction. A genuine step taken by a genuine person of genuine consequence in the world we were attempting to enter. It was evidence that our presence in the city had been noted by someone who mattered, and that the noting had resolved into an invitation rather than a continued oversight. We discussed what I would wear, which was how my mother and I conducted a large proportion of our more significant social strategizing, under the cover of the practical and the specific, the things that needed to be decided, while the larger implications attended in the background. The Thursday arrived cold and clear, with a sharp wind off the river that I could feel even inside the carriage, leaking through the seams of the window. We arrived at 7:07, which was correct. I had been briefed on this, and I had also worked it out for myself through observation, and both sources agreed. The announced time was not the real time. The real time was a few minutes after, close enough to be prompt without being eager, far enough to avoid the slight awkwardness of arriving before the host is finished preparing herself. Mrs. Hartwell's house was on East 57th Street, in a block of substantial brownstones that conveyed prosperity without showing off about it, which was itself a kind of statement. The hallway was warm and not excessive, with white tulips in a blue vase on the pier table, and a smell of beeswax and coal and something faintly floral underneath that I associated afterward with all the well-managed houses of that world, as if good housekeeping had a specific scent. The butler who took our coats was slightly more polished than Reeves, or rather differently polished. There were varieties of correctness in that world that I was only beginning to distinguish, variations of manner and address, and the management of physical space that indicated different kinds of training, different backgrounds, different households of origin. I filed this away. There were 9 of us at dinner. I was the youngest by 15 years at least, which placed me in a specific social position that I recognized as both limiting and useful. I was not expected to lead the conversation or to contribute substantially to the more experienced exchanges at the table. I was expected to be pleasant and present, and to answer when addressed with intelligence and without either excessive eagerness or excessive reserve. Within that constraint, I was largely free to observe, and I observed with everything I had. I will tell you what was at that table. Mrs. Hartwell sat at one end, managing the evening with the ease of a person who had given many such dinners and found them genuinely enjoyable rather than effortful. She was warm without being effusive, attentive without being overbearing, and she had the skill, which I was beginning to understand as a skill, something developed rather than innate, though it was so well developed in her that it looked entirely natural, of making each person at the table feel specifically noticed, specifically included, without ever allowing any one person to dominate at the expense of the others. To my mother's left sat Mr. Ogden, who was in insurance and who served on the board of something I did not immediately identify, but filed for later consideration. He was perhaps 60, with the particular confidence of a man who has been successful for long enough that success has become unremarkable to him. and he talked about business with a generality that was appropriate for a mixed table and a social occasion, and he was pleasant enough. To my right sat Miss Palmer. She was Mrs. Hartwell's niece, perhaps 26, and she was the most purely assured person I had met since arriving in New York. I do not mean self-confident, which is a different thing. Self-confidence is aware of itself, performs itself, is slightly on guard. I mean assured in the sense of being simply settled in her own position, so completely that the question of whether she was secure never came up for consideration. She had grown up knowing exactly who she was and where she stood, and it showed in every particular: the way she moved, the way she ate, the way she spoke, the quality of attention she brought to what others said, which was genuine and complete and which never tipped into the exaggerated attentiveness that I recognized in myself and in my mother when we felt we were being evaluated. She was not being evaluated. She had never been evaluated in the way that I meant. That was the gift and the limitation of having been born into the center of things. I spent the first 15 minutes of dinner studying her with the concentration I gave to difficult piano passages. I was not being unfriendly. I was learning. At the far end of the table from Mrs. Hartwell sat a woman who was introduced to me as Mrs. Fellows. I recognized the name before I had arranged my face to receive it. I do not know what I expected, something more dramatic, perhaps, something that matched the weight the name had acquired in my private thinking. What I found was a woman of perhaps 60, white-haired, dressed in black with a simplicity that was either entirely unstudied or so deeply studied that it had become indistinguishable from unstudied. Her jewelry was simple: a brooch, a ring, a thin gold bracelet. And it was worth more than everything my mother was wearing. I was almost certain of it. Not from ostentation, but from the quality that genuine old things have: a quietness, a certainty of their own value. She said very little in those first courses. She ate with the same ease Miss Palmer had, the ease of a person who has never had to think about how she appears while eating, which sounds trivial until you have sat at a table where you are thinking about it constantly. She listened to the conversation with full attention. When she spoke briefly, and what she said was precise, and I noticed that the table arranged itself around her contributions in a particular way: a slight collective tilt of attention, a quality of more careful listening than it gave to anything else that was said that evening. I had been watching for this all through dinner. The question of where the attention naturally went when it was free to go anywhere. And I had my answer within 2 courses. It went to Mrs. Fellows. Not because she demanded it, not because she performed in any way, but because the room organized itself around her the way a room organizes itself around a fireplace, instinctively, without anyone deciding to do it. The conversation over dinner touched on the cold weather, which had been sustained and severe, a concert at Steinway Hall that several people had attended the previous weekend, which generated a brief and pleasant exchange about the program, a new novel that had been reviewed extensively in the better papers. It was at the mention of this novel that I contributed for the first time to the general conversation. Carefully, briefly, with one observation about the book's structure that was specific enough to demonstrate I had actually read it, and general enough not to lecture. It was received with a kind of pleasant attention that told me I had spent my single contribution of the evening wisely, and I did not attempt another. There was a conversation about the coming weeks of the season, which evenings were already committed, what was being planned, who was known to be giving what. This I listened to with particular focus, because it was, in its way, a map. I was not in a position to contribute to it, having no evenings committed and no plans of consequence. But I could listen, and I did. And by the end of the conversation, I had learned several things about the shape of the next 6 weeks that I had not known before. Near the end of the meal, As the conversation was becoming lighter and more general, in the way that conversations do when the serious eating is finished and the dessert wine has arrived, Mrs. Fellows spoke for the longest consecutive time she had spoken all evening. She was answering a question from Mrs. Hartwell about a family they both knew. The kind of family history conversation that requires real knowledge to participate in. Years of acquaintance and social memory. She spoke for perhaps 2 minutes, and what she said was precise and faintly witty and not unkind, though it was entirely clear-eyed about the family in question. And by the time she finished, the table was very quiet in the way that tables go quiet when something worth hearing has been said. Then she glanced across the table briefly, and her eyes found mine for a moment before moving on. I did not know what to do with that. I held myself still and did not react, and the conversation moved forward. We moved from the dining room to the parlor after dinner, as was the custom. The women to the parlor, Mr. Ogden to the study with a glass of brandy he would not be alone in for long, since the table was almost entirely female. The parlor was warm and well lit with several good fires, and the arrangement of chairs had the quality of having been planned. Groups of 2 and 3 that invited intimate conversation. A piano against one wall that declared the possibility of music later. A table with the coffee service and 2 kinds of cake. A small round one and a loaf cake with dried fruit, both of which I identified as coming from a bakery I knew to be one of the better ones in the neighborhood. I chose a chair near the window, slightly removed from the main gathering of the room, not from shyness. I had overcome shyness some years earlier, or rather I had converted it into attentiveness, which was more useful, but from strategic placement. From the window seat, I could see the whole room without appearing to survey it. I could be available for conversation without thrusting myself into it. I could, in other words, observe. Mrs. Fellows chose a chair somewhat near mine. I did not know if this was deliberate. I suspected it was, in the way that very experienced social actors do everything slightly deliberately, but lightly enough that it does not declare itself. The coffee was poured. The conversation resumed in its smaller, more intimate after-dinner form. The exchanges of 4 and 5 years of acquaintance with all the ease that implies. My mother was talking with Mrs. Hartwell and 2 of the other women, and I could see from across the room that she was doing very well, present and engaged without straining, contributing with the precise economy I associated with her at her best, when her social intelligence was running cleanly and without anxiety. I was glad to see it. I was proud of her, in the quiet way you feel pride for someone who is doing something difficult beautifully. I was looking at my mother when Mrs. Fellows spoke to me. "You have been listening very carefully all evening," she said. Her voice was not loud. It was entirely for me, pitched for the distance between our chairs, which was perhaps 4 feet, and not intended to carry to the rest of the room. I turned to look at her and found her watching me with full attention. Gray eyes, clear and steady. The kind of looking that does not perform interest, but simply is interested. I considered, for perhaps half a second, what to say. The available answers ranged from the deflecting, "Oh, I always enjoy a good conversation," to the honest. "I have been trying to learn," I said. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at me with those gray eyes, and I had the sensation, which I had not had with anyone else that evening, of being genuinely seen. "That is the right answer," she said. And she looked away toward the room, and the conversation was over. I sat with those 5 words for the rest of the evening. I have sat with them on and off ever since. We came home from Mrs. Hartwell's Thursday at 10:30. My mother and I rode back through the cold streets in the carriage without speaking, which was not unusual. We were both people who processed experience in private, who needed the quiet after an event before we could talk about it usefully. The city moved past the windows, the gas lamps making their small, cold circles on the pavement, the side streets emptied by the hour, the occasional figure moving quickly in a heavy coat. I looked out and thought about the evening and felt, underneath the thinking, something quieter, something that was not yet relief, not yet satisfaction, but was perhaps the early condition of both. My mother said, finally, as we turned onto our street, "I think it went well." I said, "Yes." She nodded. That was enough for that night. The days after Mrs. Hartwell's dinner were interesting to observe. Social consequence, I was learning, was rarely immediate. It moved through the system at the pace of calls and notes and conversations, spreading outward from a central point in the particular way that news spreads through a connected community, slowly enough to be tracked if you were paying attention. Within the week following the Thursday, my mother received 2 calls from women she had not previously met. Both of them, by my assessment, of approximately Mrs. Hartwell's circle, connected to her in ways I could partially trace. These were not consequential calls by themselves. They were the extended tendrils of a network responding to new information, the information being that we had been at Mrs. Hartwell's table, had been deemed suitable company, had been, in the most fundamental sense of the social machinery, vouched for. A small vouching, a conditional one, but real. My mother returned both calls within the proper time. She began planning a tea of her own, which she discussed with me over several evenings with a specificity that told me she was taking it seriously. Who to invite, in what combinations, who would know each other, who would benefit from meeting each other, who was of a level with whom and whose presence would elevate the occasion without making the other guests feel outclassed. What to serve, which required both knowledge of the current conventions and some personal distinction, since a tea that was entirely conventional would not be remembered, and the point of the thing was partly to be remembered. I was consulted in this planning more fully than I had been in anything before, which I understood as a change in my status within the household, a recognition that my observations had value, that my knowledge of the social terrain was real and could be used. I offered some suggestions. I did not offer all the ones I had. There was a calibration required in that as in everything else. I want to say something about what I was doing in those weeks that went beyond the social observation and the notebook and the careful strategic thinking, because I think it would be incomplete if I described myself purely as a calculating observer, a young woman applying analytical attention to the machinery of society the way an engineer applies it to a mechanism. That would be true, but it would not be the whole truth. The whole truth is that I was also, underneath the observation, genuinely wondering what I wanted. Not from that world in the abstract, but from my life, which was going to have some shape or another and was being shaped in part by the decisions we were making that winter, the calls and the teas and the invitations and the careful management of our position. I was 19. I was old enough to understand that what happened in the next few years would matter to what came after, that the connections made and the social position established would determine in large part the future that was available to me, who I might marry, what world I would live in, what kind of life I would have. And I was young enough, barely but still, to find this weighing not oppressive but interesting. I was genuinely curious about who I would become. I had opinions about it, tentative ones that I had not yet spoken aloud to anyone, opinions about the kind of life I wanted that were not entirely what my mother assumed I wanted, not entirely what the world I was entering had prepared for me, but not entirely different either. I wanted to be in the center of things. I was honest with myself about that. I wanted to be present in the world that mattered, to have access to the conversations and the people and the events that made the world what it was. But I also wanted, and this I was less certain how to achieve, to be in that center as myself, not as a performance, not as the correct version of Miss Eleanor Price, well-dressed and appropriately conversational and strategically placed in the right rooms, but as the person in the parlor window with the brown notebook, the person who found the card system more interesting than the parties, the person who had told Mrs. Fellows the true thing rather than the easy thing and had been told it was the right answer. Whether those two things, the position I was working toward and the self I wanted to preserve, could coexist, I did not know, but I was thinking about it. The days of January grew shorter toward their end. February approached, with its particular quality of light, colder and cleaner than January, the days beginning almost imperceptibly to lengthen, the sky on clear afternoons going that sharp particular blue that feels like a promise of spring even when spring is still 8 weeks away. I took walks in those weeks, which I had not done much in the deepest cold of January. Not social walks, not the kind you took in company in the approved directions at the approved hours. Early morning walks, in the brief time between when the household was up and active and when the social day properly began, in the streets that were not yet busy, with the cold air on my face and the city doing its morning work around me. I loved the city in those hours. I had not expected to. Utica had been home, had been known, and New York had been for the first year a constant state of slight disorientation, an overwhelming scale and pace and complexity that I found stimulating and exhausting in approximately equal parts. But somewhere in the second year I had started to feel something different. Not disorientation, but orientation. The streets beginning to be mine, the blocks becoming known. The awareness that I understood this place in ways I had not when we arrived. On one of those February morning walks, I passed Mrs. Fellows's house. I had looked it up in one of the directories I had acquired for this purpose, and I knew the address. I walked past it at a pace that was neither rushed nor slow, the normal pace of a woman on an early morning walk. Nothing that would attract attention. And I looked at it from across the street. It was a wide house, wider than most on the block, on East 65th Street, with a quiet, settled quality that I had begun to associate with the genuinely old money of the city. Not new money making itself large and obvious, but old money that had nothing to declare, that existed in its position as simply as it breathed. The windows were covered on the upper floors. It was early. The ironwork on the front was fine and old, and had a particular dark patina that could not be bought, only accrued. I stood there for perhaps 20 seconds. Then I walked on. I did not know what I was doing there entirely. Confirming that it was real, perhaps? That the name in my notebook corresponded to something solid in the world? It did. The envelope arrived on a Friday morning in the first week of February. I was in my room when the mail arrived, not at the parlor window for once, but at my desk, writing a letter to my cousin in Utica, who had asked for a description of New York and to whom I had been promising a proper answer for 3 weeks. The morning was gray and still. The coal in my grate was burning well. Through my window, the back garden was pale and frozen, the pear tree entirely bare, its dark branches against the gray sky making an elegant angular pattern that I had been observing all winter and that was different each day, different each hour, depending on the quality of the light. I heard the front door. I heard the tray. I stopped writing. What came next was the sorting silence, which I was better at reading than almost any other sound in that house. I heard it go through the ordinary envelopes, the flat administrative sounds of bills and business letters, the briefer pause over the Utica correspondence, and then I heard it stop. A different kind of stop. A stop that had weight in it, that took time, that was doing something. I set down my pen. I waited. My mother came upstairs. I heard her steps in the corridor, her particular step, which I would have known anywhere, and then a pause outside my door, and then a knock that was both careful and certain. "Come in," I said. She opened the door and came in and sat down in the chair by the window. Not the chair at my writing desk, but the one by the window, the one we both tended to use when we were going to say something that required sitting down for. She had an envelope in her hand, cream-colored, the heavy kind. The address written in a hand I did not recognize, precise and undemonstrative, the hand of someone with nothing to prove about their penmanship. She held it for a moment. I waited. We had a long practice, my mother and I, of allowing things to be said at the right pace, of not rushing toward or away from significant moments. "We have been invited," she said, "to an evening reception." She looked down at the envelope. "At Mrs. Fellowes' house." I sat very still. The things I had written in my notebook in January, further, the word I had used to file her, the section of the map that was real but not yet reachable, rearranged themselves quietly in my mind. "When?" I said. "The 14th of February," she said. "A Tuesday evening." "That is her receiving day," I said, and then checked myself. But my mother only nodded because she knew this too. She had known it before I did, most likely. She had been mapping the same territory. "A larger reception," she said, "not a dinner. There will be many people." "Yes," I said. "It is a beginning," she said. She was looking at the window when she said it, the bare pear tree and the gray February sky, and she was speaking with a quietness that I recognized as the quietness of a person who has been working towards something for a long time and has just received the first real evidence that the working is paying off. Not triumph, not celebration, just the particular stillness of having been, after a long patience, heard. She held out the envelope. I took it. I read it. The engraved card inside, the formal and correct phrasing, the date, Tuesday, the 14th of February, 1892, at 8 o'clock, and my own name on the outer envelope, written in that precise, unhurried hand, Miss Eleanor Price. My name, in that handwriting, connected by whatever chain of observation and decision and social calculation I could not entirely trace, to the woman in Mrs. Hartwell's doorway who had said, "That is the right answer," and looked at me with those gray eyes and moved away into the parlor. I put the invitation down on the desk beside my unfinished letter to my cousin. "We will need to think about what I'll wear," I said. "Yes," my mother said, "we will." She stood up and smoothed her skirt and left the room. I sat at my desk for a long time afterward, without writing or doing anything else, looking at the card and thinking about things that I did not have words for yet and might not need words for, things that could be held without being named. The 14th of February arrived clear and very cold, with a wind off the East River that moved through the streets with a particular purposefulness, as if it had somewhere to be. By afternoon, the sky had gone that winter blue, sharp and deep and without clouds, the kind of sky that is beautiful specifically because it makes no concessions, that does not warm you or comfort you, but simply is, completely itself, indifferent and magnificent. I spent the afternoon attending to ordinary things, which is what I always did on days when something significant was coming. Ordinary things functioned as ballast, kept the day from tipping too far in the direction of the significance and becoming strange with anticipation. I practiced the piano for an hour, working through a Schubert impromptu that I had been slowly improving over the winter. I read 20 pages of a book I had been meaning to finish. I wrote 3 lines of the letter to my cousin, which brought it to the point where I could finish it in a single session whenever I chose. At 5:30, I began to dress. My mother and I had spent the better part of 3 evenings deciding what I would wear, which sounds excessive until you understand that the decision was not purely aesthetic. It was also social. What I wore to Mrs. Fellowes' reception would be noticed, evaluated, placed in context, and would contribute, as everything contributed in that world, everything was always contributing, to the assessment of who we were and where we stood. Too elaborate suggested effort, which suggested anxiety, which suggested insecurity about position. Too plain suggested ignorance, or worse, indifference, an unwillingness to understand the codes of the occasion. The target was the register that said, "I know what is appropriate here, and I have dressed appropriately, and this did not require excessive thought on my part." We arrived at ivory silk. A good silk, cut simply, with a fine trim at the cuffs and hem that was decorative without being elaborate. My mother's jeweler had cleaned the pearl earrings that had been her mother's, and they were very good in the way that old pieces are good. Quietly, certainly, without flourish. My hair was dressed by my mother's maid, who was better at it than I was and who had a particularly steady hand with pins. I looked at myself in the glass before we left. I looked, I thought, like a person who was meant to be where she was going. Whether that impression would survive the evening, I did not know. We arrived at Mrs. Fellowes' house at 8:15. The street was already lively with carriages, and there were people on the steps and just inside the door. The gradual movement of a large reception in its early stages, the particular quality of noise that many well-dressed people in a warm room create. Not loud, but full, a layered murmur that was somehow distinct from any other kind of crowd noise, as if the fabric of the clothing absorbed sound and softened it. The house was everything I had imagined from outside, which is to say it was exactly right, which is to say it was so exactly right that it seemed to require no description. It was simply the platonic form of a house of its kind, realized in warm stone and good wood and a particular quality of light that I could not trace to any single source, but that made the interior look as I imagined the houses in the novels I had grown up reading looked. The houses where things mattered and were known to matter. We passed through the receiving line. Mrs. Fellowes stood at the entrance to the main reception room, flanked by 2 women I identified as daughters or daughters-in-law, younger versions of her composed and effortless manner. She greeted each arrival with the practiced warmth of a person who has done this for decades and has not tired of it, because the warmth was genuine rather than performed. When we reached her, she took my mother's hand and said something gracious about being glad she had come, and my mother said something equally gracious in return, and then she turned to me. She took my hand. She looked at me with those gray eyes. "Miss Price," she said, "I hoped you would come." "Thank you for including us," I said. She held my hand for a moment longer than the greeting strictly required. Then she released it and smiled, the small, private smile I remembered from the doorway at Mrs. Hartwell's, and we moved forward into the room. The room was large and warm and full of flowers, all white and cream, quantities of them, roses and lilies and smaller flowers I could not identify, arranged with the particular art of arrangements that are designed to look artless, that vanish into the room rather than commanding it. There were perhaps 60 or 70 people already present, and more arriving steadily, and the room accommodated all of them with the ease of a space that has been designed for exactly this purpose, whose proportions are right for a crowd of this size, and whose arrangement of furniture creates natural nodes of conversation without forcing them. I moved through the room with my mother for the first half hour, which was the appropriate thing, to stay in company, to be introduced, to begin the work of meeting people. My mother was excellent at this, at the introductions and the brief establishing conversations and the circulation that constituted the main event of a large reception, and I moved beside her and participated and filed everything. I met perhaps 30 people in those first 30 minutes. Of those 30, perhaps 10 would matter, in the sense of being people whose names I would encounter again, whose connections were relevant to our situation, whose impression of us would carry forward into the larger social life of the season. Of those 10, I had identified 7 within the first exchange, from various pieces of contextual information, names, family connections mentioned in passing, the manner in which other people responded to them in the room. The 7 I attended to with particular care. There was a Mrs. Bancroft, to whom we were introduced by Mrs. Hartwell herself, who had arrived at the reception midway through its first hour and who was performing the same function, introducing, connecting, circulating, that I suspected she performed at every gathering of this kind, with a pleasure that was both genuine and strategic. Mrs. Bancroft was, it emerged within 3 minutes of our conversation, a cousin by marriage of the Livingston family, and she mentioned my father's name in a way that told me she had heard it recently, and that the hearing had been neither neutral nor negative. "Your father has been spoken of in connection with the Pacific lines," she said, which was both specific enough to be genuine information and general enough to be appropriately indirect for a social occasion. "My husband has some interest in that area." "I believe he would be glad to hear it," I said, which was both true and carefully non-committal. She looked at me. She was a sharp woman, Mrs. Bancroft. Sharp in the sense of precise, not in the sense of unkind. And she was clearly making assessments throughout our conversation, as everyone in that room was making assessments throughout theirs. But her assessments had the quality of genuine engagement rather than mere positioning. She was interested in what she found. "You are paying very close attention to this room," she said pleasantly. "I find it worth attending to," I said. She laughed. A real laugh, brief and genuine. "Yes," she said, "I suppose it is." And she moved on. An hour into the reception, I found myself in a part of the room that was somewhat less crowded, near a pair of tall windows that overlooked the side street, their curtains drawn against the cold, the fabric a heavy brocade in a deep gold that looked expensive and was. And I was in conversation with a young man who had been introduced to me as Edward Colburn, the son of a family whose name I recognized from the papers in connection with several of the city's larger commercial enterprises. He was perhaps 23, and he had the ease of someone who had grown up in that world without thinking about it. But it was a pleasant ease, unself-conscious rather than condescending. And when he discovered that I had attended the recent exhibition at the Academy of Design, he lit up with a genuine enthusiasm that I recognized as the enthusiasm of a person who actually cares about something and is pleased to find someone else who might. "The Sargent portrait," he said. "What did you make of it?" "I thought it was extraordinarily good," I said, "and slightly unsettling." "Exactly," he said. "That's exactly it." And we were off, into the kind of conversation that has no social purpose, no strategic dimension, that is simply two people talking about something they've both seen with the pleasure of finding someone who saw it too. I noticed somewhere in the middle of that conversation that I had stopped observing. I was simply talking. My attention was entirely on what he was saying and what I thought about it, and what I wanted to say in return. The room had receded to a background hum. This had not happened before. In any of the social occasions of the previous 2 years, I had never fully stopped observing. There had always been that dual consciousness, the part of me that was present in the conversation and the part that was watching and filing and assessing. In Mrs. Fellows's reception room, for perhaps 20 minutes, I had only one consciousness. I was simply there. I thought about that afterward, in the carriage going home. I thought it might have been the best moment of the winter. Near 10:30, when the room had thinned slightly and the reception was moving toward its conclusion, I found myself near the window again, alone for a moment, looking out through the gap in the curtain at the dark street below. The cold outside was palpable through the glass. I could feel it even with the heavy curtain partly closed, a faint current of cold air from the seams of the window. Below, the street was quiet. A single carriage moved slowly toward Fifth Avenue, its lamps making two small moving points of light in the dark. I heard her before I saw her. The very slight sound of approach, the particular quality of someone who moves quietly and is always moved quietly. Mrs. Fellows stood beside me. "You are looking at the street again," she said. "I am," I said. "You were looking at a street the last time we spoke," she said, "or rather a doorway that led to one." "I look at streets often," I said. "I find them useful." She was quiet for a moment. I looked at the street and she, I thought, looked at me. "Your mother has worked very hard," she said at last. "It has been evident to those who notice such things." "She has worked very hard," I agreed. "She is a remarkable person." "And you?" she said. "What have you been working at?" I considered this. There were several available answers, the polite ones, the deflecting ones, the ones that would sound appropriate and reveal nothing. And then there was the honest one, which I had given her once before, in a different doorway, and which she had called the right answer. "Understanding," I said. "I have been trying to understand how it works. The whole of it." She was quiet. "That is an unusual project for a girl of your age and circumstances," she said. "I did not think I had a choice," I said. "I arrived in a world with rules I did not know, and no one was going to explain them, and it seemed to me that the only honest response was to try to learn them." "And have you?" she said. "Learned them?" I thought about my brown notebook, the months of observation, the maps I had built in my own mind of the social geography of that world, its hierarchies and its connections, its rules and their exceptions, what I knew and what I still did not know. "Some of them," I said. "Enough to know how much I don't yet know." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was related to one. "That is also the right answer," she said. I turned to look at her. She was looking at the street, her profile composed and clear in the warm light of the room behind us, the white hair and the simple black dress and the small gold bracelet. "The invitation tonight was my decision," she said without turning. "Not Mrs. Hartwell's, though she was happy to arrange the meeting at her dinner. I asked her to include you." "I had wondered," I said. "I met you for 30 seconds in a doorway," she said. "Most people in that circumstance tell me something they think I want to hear. You told me something true." She paused. "I am 61 years old. I have been in rooms like this one since I was younger than you are now. I have met a very large number of people, many of them in doorways very like that one. I can usually tell within 30 seconds whether someone is saying what they mean. And in my case, I said. In your case, she said, you were saying what you meant. She turned to look at me. I find that interesting. I find it increasingly interesting as I get older. It used to be more common, I think, or perhaps I was not as good at recognizing it. I looked back at her. What happens now? I said. It was a more direct question than I would usually have asked. But she had been direct with me, and it seemed to be the right register. She looked at me for a moment with those clear gray eyes. Now, she said, you continue. You attend to the things you have been attending to. You continue to learn. You are patient. I think you are already patient. It is evident in you. And you do the work that is required, which is considerable and which does not get easier for several years yet. She looked back at the window. And you do not stop being who you are while doing it. That is the harder part. Yes, I said. The world I am showing you access to, she said, is not without its pleasures. The conversations, when they are real, are very good. The people, at their best, are interesting and worth knowing. There are things in it that are genuinely worth having. She paused. There are also things in it that will ask you to be smaller than you are. You will need to learn to tell the difference. I thought about Miss Palmer at Mrs. Hartwell's table. The perfect ease, the settled security, all the advantages of having been born into the center of things. And I thought about what I had said to Mrs. Fellows. I did not think I had a choice. And I thought about my brown notebook, and the months of observation, and what I was building in my mind about this world and my place in it. I will try, I said. Yes, she said. I expect you will. She gave me the small, private smile again, the one that felt like a shared reference, like evidence that she had seen something in me worth seeing. And she moved away from the window, back into the room, to attend to her other guests, to close the evening as a good hostess closes an evening, with warmth and care and the particular grace of a woman who has been doing this for 40 years and has found, through all of it, that it is worth doing. I stood at the window for another minute. The cold leaked in gently through the glass. Below, the street was dark and quiet and indifferent. Beyond it, the city stretched in all directions, enormous and cold and full of its invisible structures, its hierarchies and rules and uncountable codes, its 400 people and the 10 times 400 people in various states of approach and calculation and hope. Then I turned, and I went back into the room. We came home after 11. The city was quiet, or as quiet as it ever gets. The main avenues still with some carriage traffic, the side streets nearly empty, the gas lamps burning at intervals in the dark. I looked out the carriage window and did not think very much, or rather thought in the loose, unfocused way that comes after a long evening when the mind is too full of recent impressions to organize them yet, when everything is still in the state of data, waiting to be processed into understanding. My mother was quiet beside me. I was quiet beside her. The horse's hooves on the pavement made the sound that I associated now with evening returns, with the end of social occasions, with the journey back from somewhere to the quiet house where we would let ourselves finally relax. Reeves was awake. He was always awake. He took our coats and my mother's wrap and stood back with the correct expression of a butler at 11 in the evening. Present, attentive, entirely unobtrusive. My mother thanked him, and we stood for a moment in the entrance hall. My mother looked at me. There was a quality in her face that I did not often see, something softer than her usual composed expression, something that might, in different circumstances, have come close to relief. She had been working for 2 years towards something, with the particular discipline of a person who understands that the working is what she can control and the outcome is not. And she had been doing that work without external acknowledgement, without any guarantee of its eventual result, in the patient way of someone who simply continues because continuing is all there is to do. "Well," she said. "Well," I said. She nodded once slowly, as if closing a chapter. Then she went upstairs and I followed, and the house settled into its late-night quiet. I sat at my window for a long time that night. The back garden below was pale and frozen, the pear tree dark against the lighter darkness of the sky. My coal fire had burned down to a low red bed, not quite dead, giving off a steady, gentle heat that was exactly enough for the size of the room. I could hear nothing from the street on this side of the house, a silence that was, at that hour, both complete and comfortable, the silence of a house that has come to be mine in a way that the house in Utica had been mine, through time and daily use, through the accumulated weight of mornings at the window and evenings at the desk, and nights sitting exactly here in this chair looking at this particular dark sky. I thought about the evening. I thought about Mrs. Fellows at the window, what she had said and what she had not said, and what it meant that she had said it. I thought about Mrs. Bancroft's sharpness and Edward Colburn's enthusiasm and Miss Palmer's ease at Mrs. Hartwell's dinner, and what each of them had shown me about the world I was entering. I thought about what Mrs. Fellows had said about not stopping being who I was. I opened my notebook, the plain brown one, and I turned to the last entry I had made, which was from a week ago, an observation about the mail and a hypothesis about the frequency of calls from certain addresses. Below it, in the space that remained on the page, I wrote, "Mrs. Fellows' house, East 65th Street, February 14th, 1892. We were there." I looked at what I had written. It was a small fact, recorded in plain language, in the plain brown notebook, in my own handwriting. It did not capture the reception room with its white flowers and warm light, or Mrs. Fellows at the window with the cold street below, or the 20 minutes of genuine conversation that had been the best 20 minutes of my winter. It did not capture the quality of the invitation when my mother held it out to me, or the weight of the cream envelope, or my name written in that precise, unhurried hand. It did not capture any of that. It just said, "We were there." But that was the truth of it, stripped to its simplest form. We had been there. We had been in the room. We had been in the room that mattered, among the people who mattered, invited there by the woman whose word had the weight to make it mean something. It was not an arrival. I was clear about that, in the way that 2 years of careful observation make you clear about these things. It was an opening, a door that had been unlocked and opened a few inches, through which the light of something further came in at a slant, and through which, in time and with continued work and the particular patience that I had discovered in myself over the course of this winter, it might be possible to pass. There was more work to do. There was always more work to do. There were calls to make and return, teas to give and attend, social arithmetic to perform in back sitting rooms and parlors and carriages and the quiet of private rooms at the end of evenings like this one. The season had weeks yet to run. After the season, another season, and another. The distance to be covered was real, and the covering of it would take time that I could not fully calculate. But I had been in the room. I had sat at Mrs. Fellows' window and been told, by the person whose word meant what it needed to mean, that I was someone worth knowing. I had been the girl who waited for an invitation, and the invitation had come, and now the waiting was a different kind of waiting. Not the held breath waiting of a letter sitting on a hall table, addressed but not sent, but the purposeful waiting of someone who knows what she is working toward and has begun in some small and definite way to close the distance. I closed the notebook. I looked at the pear tree, black and bare and patient in the garden below, waiting as all trees wait in February for the cold to turn, for the light to lengthen, for the slow interior process of becoming to make its way outward into blossom. Outside, the city breathed in its nighttime rhythm, enormous and indifferent and full of its invisible rules. The gas lamp on the corner made its small, steady circle of light on the cold paving stones. A cab moved distantly in the direction of the avenue and then was gone. I let myself, for the length of one quiet breath, be simply where I was. In this room, in this house, in this city that was becoming, slowly and imperfectly and with considerable effort, mine. Then I banked the fire for the night, and changed out of the ivory silk, and got into bed, and lay in the dark for a while listening to the city's quiet, and thought of nothing in particular, and eventually, slowly, as sleep comes when you have had a long evening and a full day and a winter of thinking, I fell asleep.